Did you know that every day you willingly eat a rock? Yes, a rock. Humans do not eat granite. They do not eat marble. But they grind that piece of rock, taken from underground, and eat it with pleasure. Salt, scientifically known as halite. It is the only mineral that humanity eats. Today, we buy a packet of it from the market almost for free. In winter, we pour tons of it onto roads so they do not freeze. It is so abundant, so worthless. But if we rewind history a little, a completely different picture appears. There was a time when this white crystal powder was more valuable than gold. Wars were fought for it. Borders were drawn by it. The Roman Empire sometimes paid its soldiers with it. The English word salary comes from the Latin word sal, meaning salt. Even the expression used to praise someone worth his salt comes from those days, from a time when salt was money. So what happened? Why were people killing each other in the past for a stone that we scatter on the ground today? The answer is not flavor, as you might think. The answer is survival. Because in a world without refrigerators, salt was the only force protecting civilization from rotting. Today, we look at the story of white gold, the empire of salt. Before entering history, we must look at our own bodies. Why are we so obsessed with this white powder? Why can we live without sugar, but die without salt? The answer is based on a very old story. Scientists say that life began in the oceans. Billions of years ago, life first began in the oceans as single-celled organisms. Even though we live on land today, our cells still carry the memory of those first days. Salt water. We brought it with us, our blood, our sweat, and our tears. All of them are salty. We are actually small walking oceans covered with skin. Sodium, in other words salt, is the electrical switch of our body. Your nerves sending signals to the brain, your heart beating, your muscles contracting. All of this depends on the movement of sodium ions. If you completely remove the salt from your body, it is like removing the battery from a car. You collapse where you stand. The brain stops. The heart goes silent. In the early periods of human history, when we were hunter-gatherers, salt was not a problem, because our ancestors ate meat. The blood and meat of the animals they hunted already contained enough salt. They did not look for salt separately. They obtained it from what they ate. But when humans settled down, when the agricultural revolution began, that is when the biological curse called salt hunger started. There was no salt in grains, wheat, barley, or vegetables. When humans began feeding only on plants, their bodies sounded the alarm. They became weak and sick. To survive, humans had to search for salt sources in nature. And who guided them in this search? Animals. Early humans noticed that deer and goats licked certain rocks. They followed those rocks and discovered the world's first mines. The world's oldest trade routes, even before the Silk Road, were actually salt roads. Rome's famous Via Salaria road was built solely to transport salt. Civilization walked after salt. Humanity's biological need for salt made it valuable. But what made it as valuable as gold was something else. While our hunter-gatherer ancestors were carrying salt and the meat they hunted to their caves, they noticed something that would change human history. Meat that came into contact with salt did not spoil. This was crucial, because if you cannot preserve your food, you starve in winter. If you cannot preserve your food, you cannot travel far from your village. This is where salt entered the scene like a time machine. Salt had a chemical superpower, absorbing moisture. Bacteria multiply in moist environments. When salt pulls the water out of meat like a sponge, bacteria cannot survive. When you bury a piece of meat in salt, salt draws the water inside that meat like a magnet. No water means no bacteria. No bacteria means no decay. A salted fish can be stored for months, even years, without spoiling. Salt stops the biological clock. This simple chemical fact drew the map of the world. When Christopher Columbus set out to discover America, he fed the crew on his ships not with fresh meat, but with salted meat. When Napoleon marched his armies into Russia, his soldiers carried salted fish in their bags, not gold. Throughout history, a king's power was measured not by the gold in his treasury, but by the salt in his warehouses. Because if you cannot feed your army, you cannot win the war. Think of Venice, that romantic city of canals. We think Venice was famous for glass art and spices throughout history. But what truly made Venice Venice, the real source of its immense wealth, was the salt trade. By controlling the salt pans in the Mediterranean, they held Europe's salt monopoly. People reached a point where they could not eat without paying salt money to Venice. Salt was the oil of that era. Whoever had it made the rules. Salt's power to stop time made it one of history's first international currencies. The concept of salary that we expect every month is based on salt. The English salary, the French salaire, and the Spanish salario all come from the Latin word sal, meaning salt. In the Roman Empire, soldiers were sometimes paid with salt, because at that time, a bag of salt was easier to use than a bag of gold. Everyone needed salt. If someone does their job well, the English say, he is worth his salt, meaning he deserves his pay. Salt was literally money. And when something is money, kings and states pursue it. Throughout history, salt was the most preferred source of income for rulers. Much of the Great Wall of China was financed by salt taxes. But this tax sometimes brought the downfall of kings. The French Revolution was not only about bread. The real rage came from the salt tax known as the gabelle. This system was so ruthless that the monarchy not only taxed salt, but forced people to buy it. According to the law called celle du devoir, every citizen over the age of 8 had to buy a fixed amount of salt every year from the state at an exorbitant price, whether they needed it or not. Moreover, they could not use this salt to preserve meat. They had to buy another, more expensive salt for that purpose. Smuggling salt was the greatest crime. Thousands of people were sentenced to death or forced labor simply for smuggling salt. This knife at the people's throat eventually brought down the kingdom. A similar story occurred in India. The British Empire monopolized India's salt and banned Indians from producing salt from their own seas. Mahatma Gandhi responded with one of the most peaceful yet effective actions in history: the Salt March. He walked for kilometers, bent down, and took a handful of salty mud from the ocean. This simple act shook an empire's authority. A handful of salt achieved what weapons could not. Salt was not only a trade good or a tax tool, it was also a sacred bond. In the past, salt was considered so pure and incorruptible that it became a symbol of friendship and loyalty. In our culture, in the Middle East and in Russia, eating bread and salt with someone means making an unbreakable agreement. This is called the rite of bread and salt. If you have eaten someone's salt, you cannot betray them. This is the greatest unwritten law. Throughout history, betraying salt was considered bad luck. If you look carefully at Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting, The Last Supper, you will notice an interesting detail. In front of Judas, who would betray Jesus, there is a spilled salt cellar. Spilled salt symbolizes broken loyalty and approaching disaster. Even the superstition of throwing salt over your shoulder when it spills comes from that ancient ritual of driving away bad luck. And today, look again at the salt shaker on the table. That white gold for which armies marched, kings were toppled, and salaries were paid, is now on the lowest shelf of the market. It is so abundant that we dump tons of it onto asphalt in winter, so cars do not slip. We have forgotten its value, because now we have a new god, electricity, and its child, the refrigerator. We no longer beg salt to preserve our food. We press a button, and cold air does the job. But remember, technology is fragile. In a solar flare, a global power outage, or a disaster that stops the modern world, when refrigerators go silent, that small salt shaker will once again become the world's most valuable treasure. Because history teaches us this: civilizations may fall, kings may die, but salt never spoils. See you in the next video, in the story of another object that sits on our table but changed history. Goodbye.